Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Like I said in the introduction, I am here with Cristin Lyons, a partner and energy practice leader at ScottMadden. Cristin, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
I'm very, very excited to have the conversation. We talked about it a little bit before we hit record here, and I know we'll get into it later on too. But I have a lot of the Bitcoin mining community, that's pretty eager and willing to get on the show, and it's always really exciting for me to get an energy industry professional and leader and thought leader like yourself on. So very excited to jump into all sorts of fun subjects today.
Great. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Where I always like to start with the discussions is I like to hear about your background, and for you, I'd love to hear what has made you and kept you so passionate about the utility industry, electricity, energy, kind of the whole thing, because you've been in the space for quite some time.
I have. I joined ScottMadden straight out of business school in 1999. So I was thinking about what keeps me interested here. So when I joined ScottMadden, energy wasn't that interesting, candidly. We were coming out of wholesale deregulation, retail deregulation. You had a lot of gas plants being built in that era. And we weren't very much in the news. There were always big headlines if the lights went out or a big hurricane hit. And you had certain companies in that era like Enron who were making waves. But
big
your
wave.
traditional big waves is right.
Yeah.
But your traditional regulated utilities were not much in the news. And that's the era that I started in. And I was lucky enough to start working in this industry right at the point where transmission was starting to get interesting. So we had gone through wholesale and retail deregulation. As I mentioned, Enron was ascendant at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And fun fact, I actually saw Jeff Skilling speak in my energy economics class in graduate school.
Okay.
And that was when Enron was on the rise. So in that era, we were starting to look at how do you connect all of these large generation plants that had come through wholesale deregulation to enable customers to have lower cost power. So transmission became very important and very interesting. And I was lucky enough to start working with startup transmission companies in the early 2000s in an era where people were looking to invest. A lot of transmission needed to be built. The FERC got behind it and put incentives in place. And it was a very exciting time, and I got to learn about that part of the industry from the ground up. Well, you move over into the early, kind of mid 2000s into 2015 or so, and all of a sudden DERs are ascendant. And everyone's very interested in distributed resources. What's going to happen if the whole country goes to rooftop solar? Because we had net metering across the country. We heard about things like the utility death spiral, which did not come to pass, I hasten to add. But I've been lucky enough to have a front row seat for all of these things. And now we're living in an era, and I'm so grateful that my career has kind of followed this trajectory that we went from transmission being cool to then it was distribution being cool. And now, honestly, all of it's cool. We're looking at huge changes in generation. We now need more transmission again. The distributed side is getting a lot of attention. And couple that with all of the new load that's coming, it's a whole new world.
It's pretty wild. Yeah. Look, you've got people like myself, wildly fascinated in the industry, and I'm just enamored. I can't get enough. You touched on something, the utility death spiral, kind of that death by 1,000 rooftop solar cuts. I actually, even that alone, well, we won't go down that rabbit hole because that's a very deep rabbit hole, I think. But no, it didn't pan out the way, but it definitely added a lot of complexity to the grid, and it's all kind of part of that transition that we're seeing, in the marketplace in general, especially around the consumer wants. I think more so now than ever, the consumer wants that green energy. Yeah. So I also want to hear more about ScottMadden. And I think for myself, I'd love to hear more about who is ScottMadden, what are you guys doing for the industry at large. But I think you're very specifically focused on are you focused on the generators, or where is your focus within ScottMadden? Maybe go there too.
So ScottMadden is a general management consulting firm specializing in energy. So in leading the energy practice, I lead a group of professionals who have deep expertise across the energy value chain. My personal expertise is in the T&D side of the house and now in the clean energy transition. So as I mentioned, my personal career got started in energy in transmission when transmission was cool the first time. And it has evolved through the planning of distribution, grid modernization, as we call it, and now electrification, and importantly, a lot of the regulatory elements that have to follow all of that. My colleagues have similarly deep expertise in regulatory, utility scale generation, grid edge. We do a lot of work in the corporate services side of utility companies. So again, a breadth and depth of experience in the industry. And my peers have all watched the same kinds of changes that I have over these last number of years.
Sure. So maybe just to help kind of crystallize that a little more, it's, if a utility company or a generator wants help with what's going on with the energy transition, they're from the state of Minnesota. They've got the initiative to hit carbon free by 2040. We're a little either behind the eight ball, or we're not really sure how to get that fleet up to that type of a standard. They come to you guys for basically a holistic approach on how to transition, correct?
Right. We can help our utility clients do everything from responding to very specific regulatory requirements. For instance, if they have a make-ready proceeding for electric vehicles, we can help figure out how to plan and implement that type of program. If they need to relook at their capital planning to incorporate new criteria for deploying capital, we can help them do that. We can help them in capital allocation, integrated system planning, which is becoming more and more important. We can help them look at the costs associated with their gas assets and what can they do to start to manage that, or start to plan their electric system in light of the changes that are coming, like large loads, new interconnections of different types of generation, et cetera.
Okay. This is a little bit of an ad hoc question, if you will. So just having some of the projects that I personally have sort of worked on in the past, I've gotten to know a power company. They're a small generation and transmission company up in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota. Otter Tail Power Company. They were actually, I had Kevin on. He was my third ever guest on the podcast. And he shared with me that as a company, they don't really have the ability to quickly identify where they have pockets of excess, electricity. Is that something you guys would be able to come in and help do, like load studies and evaluate where pockets might be and that sort of thing?
So we're not an engineering firm, so
Okay.
we don't do the engineering studies. Where we would typically play in that would be as they're trying to look at their interconnection process for large load or generation, how does that need to work to enable those large loads or generation to connect more quickly, more effectively?
Okay, I got it. I think that's just me still learning the industry a little bit more. That's all. And we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear you maybe touch on like what are some of the new trends that you guys are seeing. And I think this leads a little bit into, I heard an interview, where you were talking about what you were calling as the trilemma, that, the energy industry is facing right now. What does all that look like? What is the trilemma, and what are you seeing out there?
So the trilemma, and I did not coin that phrase, that's been used pretty
Okay.
widely now, is the tension that's emerging between reliability, affordability, and clean energy objectives. So again, going back to when this industry was a little bit more simple, the regulated utilities focused on affordably meeting their customers' reliability needs. So keeping on the power at a reasonable price.
Sure.
What we've done through policy across much of the country is say, we want to keep reliability and we want to keep power prices affordable, but now we want to add on clean energy objectives. So we're going to ask you, utility company, to meet whether it's a net zero goal by 2050 or the federal goal is clean energy. I believe it's net zero by 2035, which is very ambitious.
Well,
so as we think about taking carbon out of the system, that's an incremental set of goals and targets that we didn't have before. So the question becomes, how can we keep those three competing priorities now in balance? And what we're seeing is that as we start to move toward more variable, intermittent, though clean resources in the wholesale mix, the question of reliability and resource adequacy is beginning to emerge at a pretty important level. And when I say important level, I mean we're hearing announcements from the heads of NERC, from FERC commissioners on both sides of the aisle, importantly, from the heads of New York ISO and PJM and MISO, and they're saying we are worried at the pace of change as we think about the combination of bringing on more intermittency and, importantly, reducing dispatchable generation in the mix. So this transition and those announcements have all shown up in the last year. And we've had two major storms, Winter Storm Uri and then Winter Storm Elliott, which have really highlighted some of the challenges of extreme weather against that changing generation mix. So I think it's safe to say that this path is going to be hard. And as we're seeing the numbers come in, it's going to be expensive.
Yeah. And I hear all of that and I just think, like, what are the generators going to do with, 2035, it's almost 10 years from now. That's not very far away. And I think I forget, I thought I saw something about how much renewable energy would need to be built out to smooth out the intermittency, but it's like a staggering amount that's just not physically possible to build. What are they going to do?
Well, I think there's not a single answer because the resources that we have available across the country are not uniform at all. When you think about wind resources up in the upper Midwest, they're great. Solar, less so. So as you start to think about those resources, is there a way to effectively integrate more and more wind? But then how do you balance that if you're going completely carbon free? Well, the question becomes, okay, perhaps there's larger interties that you need to build to regions with more solar resource, which the national labs have come out with some interesting studies there. Interregional transmission is notoriously difficult to get built. So over time, I think we're going to have to really think about at what places do we continue to need dispatchable resources in the generation mix to enable greater and greater integrations. That question is not being put quite so bluntly yet in most quarters, but you are seeing announcements like we saw out of NISO today, where they're going to have to keep some peaker units on in the city for reliability purposes because that need was not met within the time frame they needed it.
Sure. I think I also saw that in Texas down in ERCOT, I think they call it mothballing, those peaker plants, which I think has a lot to do with the incentives around keeping it offline, right? Like I think a mothballed peaker plant they're not getting incentivized to sit offline only when so it's I may be wrong there, so please, audience, if you guys are listening and that's way off base, let me know. But yeah, I think ERCOT similarly has stated that they're going to have to kind of dust the mothballs off some of those peaker plants down there for this winter too. Yeah.
Well, and ERCOT's an interesting example because they have kind of been Exhibit A for when things get really hard through Winter Storm Uri. So they have the limitation of not being interconnected to neither the eastern nor the western interconnect, which has been very intentional. But it also means that they've got to rely on just what's within ERCOT to manage peaks and valleys, dispatchable generation outside the market to meet that reliability need. So that's likely to be mostly gas plants. So they have an energy only market, which is a different construct. They don't pay for capacity, but in this case, they are looking to shore up that reliability need over time.
I didn't know that. I'll have to dig into that. Interesting. Yeah, it's the intermittency, I think, is the biggest kind of question mark about how do we navigate that while kind of hitting that carbon goal or carbon neutrality goal. And I mean, one of the things that I can think of is that they're going to need either peaker plants or things like that. It's where I was going with the question ultimately. Sorry, is I'm a little bit in my head about the question, Cristin. So I'll just spit the question out. Is when you look at peaker plants that have to sit idle or offline to then kind of ramp up and meet the needs when the sun isn't shining and the wind's not blowing like they needed to, or natural disasters happen. There needs to be an economic incentive around these peaker plants to even be there to begin with, because they take a lot of money to build and a lot of money to operate and manage and so on. Without Bitcoin mining, how are they doing that? And I'll kind of come back to where Bitcoin mining fits into that. But are there solutions for that kind of outside of like a Bitcoin mining or a large flexible load co-locating at that or anything like that?
I'm not aware of places that are co-locating as you just described. I think the challenge that you point to, though, is one that has kind of a number of facets to it. So, for instance, if we want gas-fired plants to behave differently in the market, there needs to be some kind of incentive or some kind of payment for them to be available and then used in those peak times that are, whether it's emergency energy. I've heard people describe it as kind of an insurance policy that we can keep the lights on. The New England ISO has been struggling with this question since 2014, when the polar vortex brought them very close to the edge on exactly this issue. Like, how do you keep the power plants on, running, and with fully available gas? Because they typically have interruptible gas contracts because they're in a market. The firm gas typically goes to the LDCs. They have the interruptible contract, which of course, under very, very cold conditions, means that the LDCs will get that gas first. So the question becomes, how do you start to incentivize behaviors that are very closely tied to the reliable operation of the grid? And what they've done is they've incentivized having dual fuel capabilities in New England for those generators, which, touch wood, seems to have worked. But if you look at the way the generation showed up during Winter Storm Elliott, there was a lot of oil online. And ultimately, from an environmental perspective, that's not optimal. But it does bridge the gap from a reliability perspective and arguably from a cost perspective, because in those times when gas is very tight, it's going to be expensive as well.
Yeah. It's it's just interesting to me, that the different solutions that are out there, or what are the different solutions out there, when we talk, because the other thing I try to do is pull myself out of like the Bitcoin mining industry. It tends to be a little bit of a what do you call it, like an echo chamber. It tends to be a little bit of an echo chamber in regards to like we are the solution, but are there, well, it's, I guess batteries would be another alternative, right, to help kind of smooth out, but that doesn't help the gas peaker plants and things like that. So
energy storage is certainly a solution to some of these challenges. But here's again where you start to bump up against the cost question, because battery storage at scale is very expensive. I think one of the things that we're seeing, and I think it pertains to Bitcoin mining as well, is that we're starting to see the emergence of very large loads on the system, whether they're Bitcoin or data centers and the like. And my personal belief is that over time, we're going to see those loads become more fungible. And, going back, we've had interruptible power contracts forever. This goes back to the 70s and demand side management. So the industry is not inexperienced in those types of operations. Usually they were put in place for operational reasons. So a very, very hot day in Manhattan, and you might have commercial industrial customers willing to come offline. What we've seen in the years since is that there are products through which you can aggregate and sell that into wholesale markets. So that demand response capability is valuable. We're also seeing the emergence of virtual power plants where you aggregate these resources and that gets bid into a market. And I think to the degree that these large loads have capabilities to come offline or have on-site generation or battery storage, it does two things. It gives the system much more flexibility. And it also can become a potential revenue stream for the owner of those resources because you can get paid to come offline.
Yeah.
So my hope is that these products become more sophisticated because the grid writ large is going to need much more flexibility. And I think as these technological capabilities emerge, we're going to see economic benefits that show up. And I think FERC Order 2222 is going to drive a lot of this behavior, or I should say drive more of it, because VPPs are really a thing at this point.
And so actually, I'm not familiar with FERC Order 2020. You said, sorry, what was it?
2222.
2222. Could you actually maybe touch on what that is?
Briefly.
Yeah.
So FERC Order 2222 is requiring the RTOs and ISOs to enable these distribution aggregations to participate in the wholesale market. So that has implications for all of the data that either utilities or third parties are going to have to gather for these third-party distributed energy resources to be aggregated into the market. It has a lot of potential implications for utility operations, but it's yet one more step toward using these resources in a market construct.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm actually, have you heard of a company named C Power? It's the letter C and then power.
I don't think so.
They're a virtual power plant type company where they do the aggregation of the the load, and then they're able to toggle that on and off on behalf of their customers. So I'm going to have a discussion with them in the hopefully near future here. We're still working on lining it up, but I'm super intrigued by this because it does function a lot like how Bitcoin mining functions, except it's a bigger pool of, it's an aggregation of customers. So it's different in that perspective, but it operates very similarly. I hear this a lot, and I'd actually really appreciate if you could maybe go a little deeper. I hear a lot that we're going to need more and more flexible load, but maybe help me break down why. Like, is that, and what I mean by help me break down why is that, like, we're going to have so much intermittent renewable generation come online that's going to cause a bigger swing and less base load. Like, help me kind of understand, like, why.
So I think stepping back to the way we typically have planned the transmission, distribution, generation systems, it may be worth a moment there.
Yeah, thank you.
So typically the way we planned that entire set of systems was we looked at the peak day and we said, what are the two worst things that could happen on that peak day? And we planned for that. So if peak load is 14,000 megawatts for this service territory, we plan to be able to meet that worst case scenario, plus, this major transmission line coming offline and that major generator. And so the entire system was planned to meet that specific contingency. So a couple of things are happening. One, as you think about flexible load, one of the places that can be really beneficial is that you don't necessarily have to build all of the resources to meet that peak.
Okay.
So if you can be assured of a combination of resources that can meet 13,500 megawatt peak instead of the 14,000, that's less expensive.
Sure.
The other thing that we're finding is that as renewables show up on the system, we have different times of year where we're now having energy, quote unquote, emergencies. So you may have plenty of capacity in the system, but the wind may not be blowing or the sun may not be shining, in which case flexible loads could help accommodate those places where the energy is insufficient. You may, again, have plenty of megawatts, quote unquote, that are capacity, but they may not be online because of the intermittency question. I think the challenge is that we haven't yet fully deployed all the technologies needed to enable us to rely on, we don't have to plan for peak because we know these resources are available. In those energy emergency periods, we know that we're able to call on this amount of demand response. All of those are continuing to develop today. And we as planners are not used to putting all those pieces together in this way. So it's
Sure.
very much emerging.
Okay. And I think another thing in here that I'm hearing is maybe just to clarify from your perspective, demand response is a peaker plant, something that can ramp up and spin up to meet that need, right?
It can help.
Yeah.
But if you think about a multi-day heat event, and we saw this in California in the last couple of years, very hot, over a number of days. The first day, people may say, yeah, I'm willing to drop the
Yes.
use of my AC. By the fifth day, you're going to get less and less response. And that's those kinds of customer behaviors.
Customer demand response, yeah.
Yep. For an industrial customer, they may say, I'm willing to go down for 2 days, but you want me to do this for a week? I don't think so.
Sure. So I asked that because, again, I think it's a little bit of an echo chamber thing where this may actually help with these discussions between Bitcoin miners and the energy industry. Is I hear demand response and I think about, having a large load that can come offline quickly to provide that electricity. But the caveat is they're not going to complain on the fifth day or have compliance issues with that. So like they would truly stay because they're computers. You just turn them off. There would, I think that the trick gets to be around the economic incentives to do that. The mining community tends to have a pretty heavy hand of like, what are you going to do for me? Which, we can work around that. It's all, economic incentive drives a lot of it anyway. So
no question. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's why I asked that question. Cause I think not that we may be talking past each other, but I think you guys and the traditional energy industry says demand response. And those are the things that come to mind versus a Bitcoin mining facility. Is that fair for the most part?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I'm sorry. Rather, when I, talking about demand response, you weren't necessarily, your first thought isn't a large Bitcoin mining facility that can come offline.
No, it could, but demand response could be anything. That's what's great about it is it could be thermostats and water heaters. It could be a managed charging for electric vehicles, particularly for fleets. It can be the commercial industrial customers ramping down load or changing certain processes. I do think that there are going to be loads as we look at this over time, there are going to be loads that are more flexible than others.
Sure.
You've described Bitcoin mining. I suspect the financial incentive may need to be different for bit mining to come off than for a data center. If you think about what a data center, under what circumstances might they be willing to ramp down? Holy cow. Okay, well, we'll take out our operations for DC. That's going to be a non-starter for many companies, which begs the question, are they going to need on-site resources in order to be able to respond to those kinds of signals, on-site battery storage, some flavor of renewables that they manage themselves, et cetera?
Absolutely. And God forbid the selfies and the TikTok videos ever go down.
Yes.
It's I laugh about it. It's because I'm up here in Minneapolis, and I've said this a couple of times on a couple of the previous episodes, but Facebook Meta is now going to be the second or third largest load in the whole state, with a data center coming to the Twin Cities. Not like in a rural part either. They're coming smack to the middle of the Twin Cities, which that'll be interesting. Yeah, it's all about Facebook and keeping that data online. Yeah, they're going to have different sets of redundant power, natural gas generators, things like that.
I would assume so. I think the other thing that I would point to is the fact that load is good for utilities. Let's put that out there. We've been in a declining demand growth era for decades. We haven't seen
interesting
real load growth since, if you go back, the last real ramp up was between the 70s and 2000. So load is good for utility balance sheets. That's the long and short of it. But we have been accustomed to load coming on in kind of manageable tranches. So if you think about, you take, it could be downtown Minneapolis or any other city, a building is going to be built. It's going to take a couple of years. They call the utility up and say, we want to build in this part. This is the kind of service we want. Okay, great. You can bring all that load online. Utility processes are set up to plan out that infrastructure, get everybody interconnected, all in a time span of a couple of years. But when you think about whether it's a data center or a fast charging station, that is a huge potential, very spiky load that's very different for a utility to handle, those are going to expect to come on much faster. And what happens is the upstream utility processes are not built to accommodate those kinds of loads so quickly. So you're seeing this, and we're seeing it in certain parts of the country where we have a lot of data centers coming online in a time frame that we had not previously contemplated or seen before. So as I think about customers working with utilities, like going in with the understanding, like this is something new, it's going to get figured out. There's no question in my mind, but it's not unlike the kind of traffic jams that we're seeing for companies that are trying to interconnect renewable resources through the RTOs and ISOs right now. There are huge interconnection backlogs that FERC has recently put out a rule that's meant to help address. But it's the same kind of challenge. These systems were not built for many intermittent resources to come online. They were built to accommodate a gas-fired power plant, a coal plant, a nuclear plant. So those processes are in the process of changing. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of places across the industry right now.
Sure. I didn't know that declining load growth
Declining demand growth.
Sorry. Yeah. Demand growth. Sorry.
Yeah. So it may have grown a little bit. Like good load growth was maybe 2% a year. And we're seeing some parts of the country, they're looking out and saying, holy cow, it's double digits, which we have not seen since I've worked in this industry.
Sure, it's exciting, but it creates a lot of challenges, like you were just saying. It's
right. Yeah. And it's showing up in these different ways that we're not used to.
How long do you think it'll take to kind of smooth out a process? Because I don't think between Google, Facebook, Amazon, AI, Bitcoin mining, those alone, and I know that Google, Amazon, I believe it was Microsoft, all had a gigawatt of growth per year for the next 5 years. Was kind of their roadmap. So it's like, do you think we're going to smooth this out to allow for even just the data center industry to come online quick?
So if you think about it, utilities have every incentive in the world to get these customers connected as quickly as
Hmm.
they can. So do I think they're going to figure it out? Absolutely. Is it going to be quickly or smoothly? Probably not. Because remember, these aren't the only customers that are trying to interconnect right now. As you think about these, whether it's AI driven data centers or Bitcoin mining or the rest, that's all in addition to all the vehicle infrastructure charging that we've got to put out there.
Oh yeah,
Again, very
don't
spiky,
forget that.
unusual
Yeah.
loads, right? And the larger these loads get, the more it pushes us back into a conversation about whether we have sufficient generation in the mix to meet both that peak and the energy needs over time. So these are all
Yes.
game changers. If you think about the way we have traditionally planned the system and the resources that we were meant to accommodate, both in the generation side and in the load side, it's all different.
Yeah, which brings us to kind of the opening remarks is, it's all becoming so interesting again because we kind of have to figure this thing out. I was a little disappointed. Maybe you saw the news, the new scale small modular
Mhm.
reactor project. I was a little bit sad to see kind of the unravel of that. When we're talking about the generation side, do you think like small modular reactors are you as ScottMadden kind of looking at the future of what generation looks like? Is that something on the horizon?
We're certainly looking at it. I can speak for myself and say I am bullish about small modular reactors. My hope is that we can get enough built that the cost will come down.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big barriers is that the early adopters are going to be expensive, as is true with any new technology.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. I'm bullish on it. I'm excited about it. So I mean, Cristin, we're talking about all this, and this is very complicated for how all this kind of comes together. It's you know demand growth that hasn't been seen in a very, very, very long time, coupled with kind of handcuffed processes and things like that. And we talked about this before we hit record. Is one of the things that you really enjoy about what you're doing is being able to kind of piece this all together and weave it all together. I'd love for you to touch on how you see the landscape kind of evolving or maybe piecing this all together. Like if you were to paint the picture for one of your clients as far as like how to navigate this crazy turbulent industry and waters, how would you do that? How would you kind of paint that picture?
Well, I think I would go back to that triumvirate of priorities: reliable, affordable, and clean, because those are the metrics by which we're going to be judged over time. And it's great if that we have clean energy, but if our customers can't afford it, then I don't think that's success. If it's great if we have a fully reliable system, but if we continue to rely on tons of coal to get there, I don't think that's victory either.
No.
Having said that, I think that we're going to have to introduce some flexibility into meeting those targets. It could be that we can get there with a fully intermittent generation mix, but it's going to take longer. Or we may decide that for affordability's sake, we need to keep some natural gas in the mix in a way that makes sense and is incentivized to provide that kind of insurance policy we were talking about before. I think as I'm talking with clients right now, one of the hardest parts of this is that we have so much change across all aspects of the electric value chain, across generation, transmission, and distribution. And we have interdependencies with natural gas at the wholesale level in the generation markets and at the retail level as you consider customers who are trying to make a decision about electric or gas service.
Mm-hmm.
All of those interdependencies have to be addressed somehow. And we're starting to see companies begin to look at how to assess trade-offs across those attributes. And I'm pointing to integrated system planning. So we're starting to see companies say, okay, given how load is changing and what we have available in terms of resources at the distribution level, how do we need to build out transmission and distribution together in a way that makes that system more reliable and enables those resources? And those, because of the way the markets were disaggregated, 20, 30 years ago,
Sure.
We don't have good tools to assess those options in places where the markets have disaggregated those resources. So we're starting to put Humpty back together again.
Okay. I like that.
And I
Yeah.
think we need to start looking at both process and tools to enable those discussions of trade-offs. It's going to be hard. That's the long and short of it. And we're also the externalities that are facing the industry right now, things like the new loads we just talked about. Until someone comes and talks to the utility, they don't know what's coming.
Yep.
So I think if I were to advise a utility client on this, I'd say, let's get our heads up and look at what's coming, even if it's not, they haven't knocked on the door for interconnection yet.
Yeah, I really love that. Thank you. Are by and large, are the groups receptive to that as far as like, hey, we need to have a head up on this? And because it's kind of an intangible thing, it's like we'll prepare for it. But then 5 years goes by, because I know how busy things get, are they receptive to that type of messaging?
So conceptually,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
But when you think about the inertia behind the systems that are in place today, we've got decades and decades of doing things this way, again, with the mind to keeping it affordable and reliable. And they've done that very well. Utilities are sometimes criticized for not being more innovative. Well, when your job is to keep the lights on, and that's kind of the parameter that you're judged on, there's a reason that's your focus.
Yep.
No,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, but the upside is that load is good for these companies. This is a win for everybody. If we can do this well, we get all kinds of new load served in a reliable manner. These companies evolve, and I think they are evolving. I absolutely think that's happening either through their own efforts or through regulatory requirements. But it's an unpredictable time, and it's hard.
Yeah, it's gonna be hard. It's hard conversations, hard transitions, and it's 2035, 2040. I mean, both of those dates are coming. 2050, all of it's coming quick. Like I said, you put your head down and it shows up very quickly. So I appreciate all that. Cristin, I'd also be remiss if I didn't also just ask you, mostly because you had actually sent me the article by your colleagues. Are you, as ScottMadden, looking at Bitcoin mining as an industry, as a tool, or something to put in the tool belt to help in this pretty complex picture and industry?
So I think there are certainly opportunities there. Not being an expert on the technology, or importantly, the economics that could drive behavior of some of the Bitcoin companies, depending upon the economics and the need, certainly. I would also suggest that Bitcoin mining is, again, one of the places where utilities are going to see this load grow. And the more that's true, and the more they get experience working with these really large loads that may look and act differently from an economic perspective than others, I think that'll benefit us all.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. It's I was just curious if this was something that you guys as a group were looking at as again, kind of that tool to have in the tool belt. So I appreciate that a lot. Just to keep a tab on the time, you've been very gracious with your time to carve out an hour and have this discussion. I wanted to give you a chance to give a handoff to the audience, so that I'd love for them to be able to get in touch with either yourself directly or ScottMadden at large. Again, my audience is pretty heavy in the Bitcoin mining industry, so I think there's a lot of good learning that we can do from, such an industry leading group such as ScottMadden. So please give a hand off to the audience.
Sure. So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the conversation. If you're interested in contacting me directly, you can do so via scottmadden.com. And if you're interested in further information on some of the topics I've talked about today, please look up our energy industry update, also available on scottmadden.com.
Awesome. Cristin, this has been an absolute pleasure. Again, I really appreciate the time, and thank you. You take care.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Ben.